So after about the first millennium of the Christian era, there was a long gap before Buddhism reached any other major cultures. In fact, the area over which Buddhism was the main spiritual tradition shrank over that period, as Islam drove Buddhism out of places like Persia, Afghanistan, Central Asia, what's now Pakistan, Malaysia. It was a much more militant and aggressive religion. It cleared Buddhism out of certain areas. But then, of course, in the 20th century of the Christian era, something new started to happen. Many people in what had been Christian countries, like the UK, began to reject Christianity, or Christianity no longer seemed to mean very much to them. And some of those people, realising there was a vacuum, that we need a spiritual dimension in our lives, looked for something that seemed to make more sense, something that they had a personal connection with, that gave them some personal spiritual experience, and began to turn to Buddhism. So suddenly Buddhism started to spread again after maybe 1,000 years of just shrinking. It suddenly started to spread again. But this time to the West, to Europe, to America, and to the other places that are sort of influenced by those cultures. And at first what happened was that traditional Eastern forms of Buddhism from, first of all, from Southeast Asia, and then from Japan, and then from Tibet, were imported in a sort of unaltered form into the West. But wherever Buddhism has gone, whenever it's entered a new culture, it's always adapted. It's always found ways to speak the language of that culture, to express itself in the sort of concepts that are familiar to the people of that culture, to align itself to suit the needs and the weaknesses and the strengths of people in that culture, to find what they actually need to practice, which may be somewhat different from in the West to what a Tibetan peasant or a Japanese fisherman in the medieval times needed to do. And that process of adaptation has also started to happen in the West. It's also started to happen in the West. And one of the first Buddhist movements to really sort of take that process on at a conscious level was Aslan, the people who started this centre, the Triratna, what was the Western Buddhist order. So in the early 70s, in the 60s, Sangha, who at the time was the senior most English Buddhist monk, who'd had experience of all three major strands of the tradition in the East, had teachers from all those strands, came back to Britain, and in the early 70s he started what he called the Western Buddhist order. Nowadays we call ourselves the Triratna Buddhist order because we've re-exported Buddhism. We've re-exported a Buddhism suited to the contemporary world back to India, where it started and where it's died out. We've re-exported Buddhism back to India, and several hundred of the members of our order are Indian, so we can't really call ourselves the Western Buddhist order because it doesn't make sense. We've also got, of course, Buddhist orders and Buddhist order members in all sorts of other places, so we're no longer Western, and we call ourselves Triratna. So from now until early autumn, we're going to look at what we could call Triratna Buddhism, if you like. Obviously, what we do is very grounded in the Buddhist tradition. We go back to the teachings of the Buddha very much. We also draw inspiration from other Buddhist movements. But there are emphases, aspects of the way we approach the Dharma, which are particularly geared, particularly suited to our needs in our society, suited to how we need to practice here and now. The Buddhist ideas and practices are particularly useful for us, that take on board our strengths, our weaknesses, and the situation that we live in. So that's what we're going to be looking at over the next, until early autumn. And to kick that, I'm going to kick that off in earnest next week. But this week I'm going to focus on just one aspect of the Triratna community that's particularly relevant right now, this week. So this Friday evening we're going to welcome back Samagita, who used to be called Terry, who's just come back from her 3-month ordination retreat in the mountains of Spain. And so come to that celebration. It's starting at 7:30 on Friday, and there'll be a shared meal from 6 o'clock. So you're all warmly invited to come to that. Look at the notice board as well. Details are on the notice board. So yeah, Samagita's coming back, newly ordained, and we're celebrating that on Friday. And then on Saturday, the being who used to be called Sally Birch will be publicly ordained into the Triratna order right here in Sheffield. Sally couldn't go on the 3-month retreat for health reasons, so she's being ordained on a shorter retreat in Wales, and her public ordination will take place here. And that will be happening, I believe, at 2 o'clock on Saturday. So come to that as well, celebrate Sally becoming a member of the order. Again, look at the notice board. So by next Saturday afternoon, there will be 2 new members of the Triratna Buddhist order in Sheffield. So this is a really good opportunity to explore what does it mean to be ordained into the Triratna Buddhist order? Why do we have an order in the first place? Why the dickens would anyone want to be ordained into it? And what does this ordination really mean? What does ordination really mean? I mean, order members are the people who make the Triratna community happen. Centres like this and our associated businesses and charities and retreat centres and so on, they're all the way order members of the Triratna order express themselves in the world. They're the way we express the altruistic dimension of our practice, if you like. The main way we try to make a difference to the world. We try to give to the world. So exploring a little bit what being an order member is all about is a good way of starting our series on Triratna Buddhism and Buddhism for the contemporary world. So that's what I'm going to look at tonight. So this idea of ordination goes right back to the time of the Buddha. In the Buddha's time, when someone wanted to dedicate themselves completely to the spiritual life, the Buddha would give them what was called the going forth. He would give them the going forth. He would publicly acknowledge a change of identity. So the old self, caught up in worldly concerns, was being left behind. A spiritual death was taking place, and a new self, concerned primarily with spiritual values, was being reborn. The person would completely give up their property, any property they have. They would give up their old caste that used to define their status in society. They would completely give up their old worldly identity and their old worldly concerns. And that was symbolised by getting rid of the white robes of a normal member of society and taking on the yellow robes of a spiritual renunciant. These days the robes of a monk might be made out of really fine silk. But in the Buddhist times, those robes weren't dyed a nice orange or a yellow. They were a sort of dirty brown dun colour because they were cast-offs salvaged from the rubbish heaps. People dressed in whatever they could find, any old rags from the rubbish. So people who underwent that dramatic spiritual death and spiritual birth of going forth from a worldly identity took on the dirty brown robes as a symbol that, well, from now on, they had no worldly position. They had no worldly position, no worldly status whatsoever. They were giving up the whole ego game about position in the status pecking order of society. So when someone went forth from the household life to the spiritual life, they swapped those nice clean robes of the normal person for the dirty brown robes of the spiritual bum, the spiritual tramp. And they shaved off their hair, and they shaved off their beard, and they shaved, if they've got one, and they shaved off their eyebrows, and everything else that might contribute to their identity, their old identity. They gave up all their property and all the comforts they were used to, all their old likes and dislikes, and they lived rough for most of the year, sleeping out in the open, sleeping in the forest, eating whatever they could beg. They weren't monks. They weren't monks in the sense that we understand monks. A Buddhist writer called Reginald Ray has described them as forest renunciants. Forest renunciants, that's quite a nice sort of reputable way of describing them. They were wild, disreputable, subversive radicals. The sort of people you sort of go round, you know, when you see them on the street. People who in principle had given up all the old ego games involved in living a life based around possessions, pleasures, status, security, and were dancing to a completely different drummer to the ordinary people of the towns and villages. Compared to those people, the life of a monk as we understand it could be dead cushy, actually. In fact, in some situations it could be easier than trying to live in the challenges of the world. Okay, of course, not all, going back to the time of the Buddha, not all the Buddha's followers were willing or able to take that sort of radical step. Many householders and what we tend to call lay people, ordinary people, people who weren't full-time spiritual practitioners, many of those people also went for refuge to the Buddha. Many of them were very sincere and dedicated practitioners. And the Pali Canon tells us that many of those lay followers also made a decisive breakthrough into new levels of being. They made real positive spiritual progress, just as much as some of them, just as much as the renunciants. So in the Buddha's time, the Sangha, the community of the Buddha's disciples, consisted of those two groups, the radical forest renunciants and the householders and the lay people of various sorts, which included, the lay people included kings, ministers of kings, rich businessmen, traders, cattle herders, housewives, and at least one courtesan. So, pretty wide cross-section of society. And the Buddha made it clear that radical commitment to the spiritual life, that sort of radical going forth, was the way to get the furthest, the fastest. He made that clear. But he also made it clear that people with families and responsibilities could also practice the Dharma effectively if they had enough commitment. So you get those two groups in the early Sangha. Full-timers with no responsibilities who were also celibate. So the celibate renunciants and people who were married, had families, jobs and so on. And at that time, in most traditional societies, you really had only those two options about the general nature of life, or your lifestyle, partly because of tradition and partly because of sex. Okay? So in traditional societies, if you had a sexual relationship with a member of the opposite sex, you became enmeshed in a web of traditional family obligations. And unless one or other partner was infertile, you had children, and then you had more children, and then you had even more children. There was no such thing as contraception. And if you had children, you had to feed them and clothe them and rear them and help them establish themselves in the world, which was going to take up a lot of energy for a very long time. And in traditional extended families, you also had a responsibility to look after all sorts of elderly relatives and other dependents as well. So unless you were rich, you weren't going to get much freedom. And you weren't going to get much time or solitude or space to devote to in the spiritual life. But in today's world, that's what it's like in traditional societies. In today's world, two things have happened that mean that old hard and fast division between what we call monks, the spiritual renunciants, and the, quote, lay people, the householders, is not so relevant anymore. For one thing, in the traditional Buddhist world of the East, the wild forest renunciants have changed into respectable monks who have a roof provided over their head, who might be supported by the national government or by a very rich landowning order, who they're fed and clothed. They've got a lot of status in society. Far from being statusless, they now have a lot of status in society. It's not the same thing anymore. And for another thing, we've got much more freedom about the way we live. There are many more lifestyle options open to us. And we can have no children. If we decide to have a family, we can decide how many we're going to have. We can limit the size of our families. So we've got loads more options. There are loads more lifestyles available to us. We live in this very, very free society where we can live in a host of different ways. We don't just have to decide this or that. So for those reasons, when Sangha came to set up what was then called the Western Buddhist order, when he was trying to find a way that people in the West could live a really serious Buddhist life in the sort of society we have today in the West, he didn't see the need to repeat that split between the monks, if you like, and the lay people. As he put it, he coined this phrase: commitment is primary, lifestyle is secondary. In many Buddhist schools, lifestyle is seen as primary. Okay, so the lifestyle of a monk. In many Buddhist schools, if you're a monk, you're a real Buddhist. If you aren't a monk, over most of history, people who weren't monks didn't meditate. Their practice was seen as supporting the monks. So lifestyle was primary. The lifestyle of a monk was what defined you as a real Buddhist. So Sangha came up with this saying: commitment is primary, lifestyle is secondary. Of course, saying lifestyle is secondary is a bit dangerous, because wouldn't we all like to find a loophole that allows us to live a perfectly ordinary, hedonistic consumer society lifestyle with a nice big car and a nice big house and loads of stuff? Wouldn't we like to find a way that we can say living like that is being a real Buddhist? So, saying that lifestyle is secondary could be seen as giving us a way of saying, right, I can have it all. I can have it all. So Sangha slightly modified that saying. He said, commitment is primary and lifestyle is secondary, but not unimportant. Of course, the way we live makes a difference. Of course, our lifestyle makes a difference. But it's not being a monk or a householder that defines whether we're a Buddhist or not a Buddhist. That's the point he's making. It's our commitment that defines whether we are a Buddhist or not a Buddhist. So when Sangha came to the point of starting off a new Sangha, a new community of committed spiritual Buddhist practitioners in the conditions of 20th century Britain, he was, in one sense, he was following in the footsteps of the Buddha. He was following the tradition of the Buddha in marking people's radical change of direction in life by a rite of passage and acceptance into an order, which is what the Buddha did. He was copying the Buddha in that, acceptance into an order that would support them and give them a context for their practice. But at the same time, he didn't see the need to just carry on the split between monastic and lay practitioners that had grown up in the Buddhist world in the East. It was now much more possible to live in a whole variety of different ways and to find new ways of living a very dedicated Buddhist life. So in the Triratna order, we have people who, so we in the Triratna order follow in the tradition of the Buddha in having an order of people who have committed themselves in a wholehearted do or die path, way to the spiritual path. But at the same time, members of the Triratna Buddhist order live in a whole variety of different ways. Some are as close to being forest renunciants as it's possible to get in our world. I know people who spent considerable time living in yurts on cold mountainsides, that sort of thing, meditating a lot of the time. Even folk have chosen to live among the homeless on the streets of Mumbai, which is pretty radical. Some of us live what is effectively a monastic lifestyle, living in single-sex communities, working maybe in Buddhist centres or in Buddhist cooperative businesses. Some live in communities, but then work out in the world. Some live with a partner. Some have families. Some work as surgeons, doctors, teachers, social workers, psychiatrists, gardeners and builders. Many people live in quite different ways in different times in their life. So I, for example, I've lived in 3 communities over a number of years. I've worked in Buddhist businesses. I worked in Windhorse Publications. I've also worked in an NGO that worked in West Africa and also as a fundraiser for various charities. Now I work at a Buddhist centre and live with my partner, Surimati. So you'd find it difficult to define my life as being about one lifestyle. And the same could be said about a lot of people in our order. People live a range of lifestyles, and often they live in quite different ways at different times in their lives. Perhaps according to circumstances or according to the needs of the situation. So what unites order members is not that they all live the same lifestyle, it's at the time of their ordination, they all share the same commitment. Commitment to living a Buddhist life themselves and a commitment to bringing a spiritual community into existence. To changing the world for the better by creating a new way of people living together and being together. Creating a Sangha. And ordination into the Triratna Buddhist order is just as much a rite of passage as ordination was in the time of the Buddha. And it marks the same sort of spiritual death of the old person and spiritual birth of a new being whose overall concern is much more with spiritual things than with worldly things. So, okay, at the risk of being a bit technical, Sangha has sort of come up with some terminology from this. He said that what defines being an order member is what he calls effective going for refuge. Effective going for refuge. The term going, you've got to explain all of that, haven't you? The term going for refuge is a sort of Buddhist code, okay? Means absolutely nothing, does it? It's Buddhist code, but it goes right back to the time of the Buddha. It goes right back to the time of the Buddha. At the time of the Buddha, over and over again in the Pali Canon, people would just be complete, they'd think, yes, this is it. They'd say, it's like something that was upside down, has been turned the right way up. I go for refuge to the Buddha. I go for refuge to his Dharma. I go for refuge to his community, his Sangha. And that happens over and over again. So that language was always there. Going for refuge, it meant really committing yourself. And sometimes people object to the language of going for refuge because it sort of sounds a bit cowardly. It sounds a bit as though you're sort of running away from something, looking for refuge. But to understand it, we've got to get hold of the fact that we all go for refuge to something or some things. What we go for refuge to is what we look to give our life meaning. The thing we look to give us fulfillment. So some people go for refuge to the romantic myth. They think that if they could just find the right soulmate, they would live happily ever after. And some people go for refuge to family. Some people go for refuge to career. Some people go for refuge to wealth, financial security. Some people go for refuge to status in society. They think, well, you've got to have the right car that makes everybody think, ooh, they're important. The right sort of house. Some people go for refuge to pleasure. What their life is about is a search for pleasure, having a good time. Some people go for refuge to the internet, bizarre as it may seem. Social media, gadgets. Many people in Britain seem to go for refuge to their house. They buy magazines about houses, they buy magazines about furniture, and decor, and they watch TV programmes. TV's full of programmes about houses and things. So people go for refuge to all those things. Some of those refuges are better than others. Some do give life a real meaning, or could give life a real meaning. Others don't give any meaning at all, they're just completely silly. But the trouble with all of these refuges is that they aren't reliable, even the best of them. Even the best of them. You can go for refuge to your family. You can take your responsibilities to your family really seriously, make sacrifices and do the best you can. And then the children leave home. They don't write for years. The empty nest syndrome. All your meaning has just flown the nest. Or you go for refuge to your career, and then there are some cuts. And suddenly it's decided that we can do without what you do, and your sense of who you are is gone. Or even if that doesn't happen, you retire. You retire, and then you potter and look at the roses and wonder what it was all about, really. So those refuges, even the best of them, aren't reliable. And order members, like the people who went for refuge in the time of the Buddha, are people who've made a decisive shift away from going for refuge to possessions, to pleasures, the consumer society, status, security, and so on, and first and foremost allow spiritual values to set the direction of their life. That's what they're about. They go for refuge to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, as we put it. And then when other order members can see, when that starts to happen to someone, if order members start to see that that's happening to somebody, that shift has happened, and that shift is probably going to last. They've been doing it for a while now, and it seems like it's permanent. They've actually made that shift in a permanent way, or at least a permanent way as long as they're in reasonable situations. That it's not just a sort of temporary inspiration, and next week they'll decide to go off and, I don't know, go and become a ski instructor in Chamonix or something. But it's going to last. Well, that's what we mean by effective going for refuge. So when order members recognise that that's happening with somebody, they're invited to become a member of the order. Okay, of course the fact that order members primarily go for refuge to spiritual values, to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, doesn't mean they have no other refuges, and it doesn't mean they have no other sources of meaning, and it doesn't mean they have no other sources of pleasure. Some do have families, and they take their family responsibilities really seriously. Some have real genuine vocations to be, I don't know, a doctor, an artist, a musician, and they take that very, very seriously. That's the way they give to the world. But still, so that it's not that you become one-dimensional, but what is central still is Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, spiritual values. So we're not a monastic order, but becoming an order member should mean just as much wholehearted commitment as becoming a monk, certainly as much. In fact, it is very much more difficult to become an order member in the Triratna movement than it is to become a monk in traditional Buddhist societies. You can become a monk fairly quickly and easily. It usually takes people years of training to become an order member. You have to do a lot of special retreats. You have to give up yourself as give up your idea of yourself as a sort of private person who has areas that are your business and nobody else's business. You have to sort of work to become transparent to your spiritual friends. You have to open up about things you'd rather not, thank you. You have to put yourself in a position of opening up to more experienced people and taking what they say very seriously. Taking your sort of spiritual friends, what they say, very seriously. Even when it isn't the most comfortable or convenient thing to do. You have to actually listen to them and maybe take their advice. And you can do all of that. You can go on all the retreats, you can jump through all the hoops and still not be ordained. As long as the spiritual death and the spiritual rebirth we're talking about hasn't really happened. As long as you're doing it as a career move or to be important or to get some status within the movement or, you know, for whatever reason, if that hasn't happened, if that spiritual death hasn't happened, if you're really still dancing to the tune of your ego, you do all of that and they'll say, oh no, not this year. In fact, that used to happen to me all the time. It took me 13 years. It took me 13 years from asking for ordination to be ordained. I had done all the right things, for heaven's sakes. I'd lived in a community, I had a cracking meditation. I'd lived in 3 communities, I had a cracking meditation practice. I'd written a book about the Dharma, which for heaven's sakes had turned into a bestseller. But I was still basically an individualist who thought I was special. And I didn't really understand that it wasn't just about me and my spiritual life joining the order. It was about creating a community. It was about creating Sangha, which means we have to get our own individualism and our own sense of being a special little person out of the way. We have to get that out of the way and come together with others to create something bigger than any of us. That penny hadn't dropped. So every year it was, well, yes, but not this year. Wait and see. Oh God, I got annoyed. So it's not easy. It's not easy at all. It requires a real commitment to become an order member. And there are no guarantees. And then when you're given the okay, most people go on a long, when you're invited, most people go on a long, intensive retreat in a remote and, well, it certainly used to be, challenging conditions in the mountains of Spain. For men it's a 4-month retreat, for women a 3-month retreat. I remember one of our first breakfasts sitting there with my cagoule on in the outdoor dining room with the wind howling around us in silence, and Mangala just broke the silence saying, "This is just like a Siberian prison camp." I don't wish to put you off. In fact, it was wittier than that. It was something like, "This must be what Siberia is like," or something like that. So it's not easy, and there are no guarantees. So that's what Sangha Gita is just coming back from, a 3-year retreat, a 3-month retreat. Men do a 4-month retreat, women do a 3-month retreat. That's equality for you. And that's what she'll be coming back from. Sally, the being who was Sally, who's getting ordained on Saturday, isn't doing that retreat because her health's frankly not up to it. For health reasons, she's not doing that retreat. So if people have special circumstances, then that's taken into account. But for most people, that long retreat is an essential part of preparing for ordination. It's just the final step. You've already done loads of ordination retreats before that. So it's difficult. It's a challenge. And personally, I wouldn't want it any other way. Even when I was involved in the process, and even when I was infuriated by the whole thing, I wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Because it's a challenge, it's worth doing. If it was easy, if anyone could do it, how much would it mean? What would be the point of belonging to an order that anyone could get into, even if they weren't really that serious or committed? What would be the point of that? So I think one needs to rise to it as a challenge. And I think we also need a bit of a mythic vision of what it means to be ordained. We need a bit of a mythic vision. Myth tends to be denigrated in our society, where we say, oh, it's just a myth, it's just a myth. But really, real myth is, in the highest sense, is a story that encapsulates a deep meaning, a meaning that's deeper than logic and common sense, but a meaning that gives life meaning. Logic and common sense might lead us to live a life based around possessions and pleasures and security. But for the sort of person who might want to be part of the order, that would be a life with no deep meaning. A life that would be unfulfilling and would ultimately lead to unhappiness. So myths are stories that give life meaning. Myths are stories to live by. They are stories that get our depths involved. So at the risk of repeating myself over and over again, I'll just invoke this image of the cellar, the medieval banqueting hall deep in our being, where there's this medieval banqueting hall with wonderful tapestries down the wall, big long table, ornate carved chairs, and all these wonderful, beautifully dressed figures sitting around this table, kings and queens and bards and holy men and warriors and poets and sages, and they're all fast asleep. And every now and then, and they're all covered in cobwebs as well, just for additional. And every now and then one of them looks up and says, "What's he doing now?" "Boring," and they all go back to sleep again. So we've got to wake up the figures in our cellar. Unless those figures are alive and active, our life will be dull and boring. And living mythically is the way that we wake up those figures. When I was involved in the ordination process, I used to think of one of my sort of mythic approaches to ordination was I thought of it as a bit like joining a chivalric order, like the Knights of the Round Table. To join the sort of chivalric order that I was relating to mythically in my mind, you had to prove yourself. You had to prove yourself. You had to go through trials and challenges. That was part of it. That was the way you not only proved yourself, but you became worthy and strong by doing the challenges. That was the way you acquired enough virtue to deserve to belong to such a noble body of people. And you weren't putting yourself through all these trials for any selfish gain. Joining that sort of mythic order of knights was about putting small selfish concerns to one side and joining with others in a higher cause. It was about becoming a truly noble person, a truly worthy person. And, well, in some ways, joining the Triratna Buddhist order is a bit like that. It involves trials and challenges, and it needs a lot of commitment. And partly the trials and challenges are the way you work on yourself. They are the way you leave your old self behind and step into a new, bigger identity. Leaving the old self behind and experiencing a spiritual rebirth sounds nice, doesn't it? It sounds really nice. But what it really means, what trials and challenges really mean, is being pushed out of your comfort zone and going, ah! What it really means is being pushed to the edges of what you can cope with, actually. Being pushed beyond your comfort zone. So that was one take, if you like, on joining, mythic take on joining the order that definitely meant something to me when I was preparing for ordination. So there's another myth that's pretty central, actually, to what the order means. It's more of a public myth that didn't really mean that much to me for quite a long time. And that's the reason that this is, because I couldn't quite connect with this myth, it's the reason that it took me so long to get ordained. And this is the myth of the Thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara. So Sangha Night has proposed this image of the Thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara as a symbol of our order. So the Thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara has 1,000 arms, strange but true. He's a very, very weird figure. He's got all these arms and they're all offering different things. We can imagine some offering wooden spoons for cooking, some offering spades for digging the allotment, some offering books, some offering evolution toys, some offering, I don't know what else. all these different ways that we make a contribution. So 1,000 arms offering what they can offer. And these arms represent individuals. They represent individuals with offering their particular gifts to the world. But these arms, these 1,000 arms, aren't, they're not just, well, they're individuals, but they're not independent in a certain sort of way. They're individuals, but they're united. And the unity is sort of symbolised by two of the arms of Avalokiteshvara are held to his heart, and they're holding a shining jewel to his heart. And this jewel is metta. This jewel ultimately is the bodhicitta, the will to enlightenment for all beings. So that is an image of, that is Sangharakshita's image of what the order should and could be. A host of individuals offering what their particular gifts to the world, but united around this jewel, all united. All making their unique contribution, but all united by a common will, a common motive, even a common mind that transcends all the individuals involved. I remember this myth didn't make sense to me. In fact, I once wrote to the person who became my preceptor and said, well, it's not really like that, is it? It's much more like Avalokiteshvara's this monster who's got 1,000 arms, who picks people up and then eats them. So that was me, mythically, expressing, I suppose, a fear that a lot of people have, that somehow joining the order or being deeply committed to a spiritual path means a loss of individualism. Not a loss of individuality. It does mean a loss of individualism. A loss of individuality. But it doesn't. We're really clear that this is a community of individuals who choose of their own volition to come together around something bigger than themselves, while staying individuals, while very much staying individuals. So Sangharakshita uses the analogy of an orchestra for this. He says, well, you know, you learn to play the flute or you learn to play the drums. Joining an orchestra does not mean that the flautist ceases to play a flute or that the drummer ceases to play drums. What it means is that you come together in harmony to do something that none of you could have done together. You come together to create something much bigger than any of you. A single instrument cannot play Beethoven's Ninth. You can't do it. You have to come together with others. So there's no loss of individuality, but there is a voluntary coming together with others. So Sangharakshita, he's fished up a word from, I think, Polish or Russian about this, which is sobornost. Sobornost. And apparently sobornost describes a community of free individuals, I think it's a Serbian word, a community of free individuals united by loving fellowship, united by a common purpose based on love. And that is what the order seeks to be. And Sangharakshita speaks about this as what he calls third order consciousness. So he talks about 3 levels of consciousness. He talks about the consciousness of what he calls the group member. So the group member is the conventional human whose views and motives are determined and conditioned by the society around them, who believes what other people believe at this moment in history, goes along with the herd. Most people. Then you have the second order, what he calls the true individual. The true individual who is actually able to think for themselves, not bound by the ways of thinking that are fashionable at the moment or in the place they happen to be. Able to make their own decisions about what's true and how to live. So an autonomous, self-governing individual. That's the second order of consciousness. And he distinguishes that from the individualist. So there's a difference between the individual, who I've just been describing, and the individualist. The individualist hasn't quite got that amount of individuality, so they feel threatened by the community around them. They feel threatened by the conventional group because they're not really free from it. So they're sort of in reaction to it. They're sort of non-conformist. They're specifically trying to not conform, or to go against the herd, or to stay out of groups, because their individuality isn't quite developed enough to survive within a group. That's, if you like, the individualist. So we've got those two, the group member and the true individual. But then he describes third order consciousness as the consciousness of a community of true individuals united in love around a common purpose. A community of individuals who come together to become something bigger than any one individual, and therefore able to achieve far more. The Thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara. And in a way, the turning point for me in my process towards ordination was seeing the point of that. Actually seeing the point of that. Becoming sure enough of my own individuality that I didn't think I was going to be eaten, that I thought I could join in and contribute. Becoming willing to put aside my individualism and join with others in something bigger than me, for a purpose that was bigger than me, and more important even than my personal spiritual development. So there's a bit of a catch-22 in the spiritual life, that if you think my personal spiritual development is what it's all about, it's still all about you. It's still all about me. But the whole purpose, or the whole gauge, if you like, of progress in the spiritual life is to become less all about me. So how can I become less all about me? By being all about me, even my own spiritual development. There's a catch-22 there. And the way out of that catch-22 is to make our spiritual life about, to some extent, not ceasing to do the things that work for my spiritual development, but getting my small self out of the way to some extent to come together with others, getting over oneself. So I came to see ordination is not about getting anything for yourself. If you see it that way, it's not going to work. It's about giving. It's about giving. It's about being able to make a contribution. It's about being able to give more and more effectively. We all probably want to change the world for the better. We all probably want to help others and to make a contribution. But as single, isolated individuals, there is really very little we can do. But when we come together in a spiritual community, characterized by subordinates, we can really make something happen. The world is absolutely full of impotent idealists whose individualism stops them actually achieving anything. Because to do that would mean coming together with others. And they can always see the faults in any organisation or in any groups of people, so they won't do that. Won't give up any individualism, won't make any compromises, so won't join together with others, so achieve zilch. Nothing is ever good enough. See the faults, the inevitable faults in any community of people. Keep ourselves aloof. Don't make anything happen. And I'm afraid that was a bit like I was for quite a long time. For all my Dharma knowledge and all my meditation practice, I sort of looked around and thought, the Sangha. Bit of a motley crew, aren't they? A bit better than most of them. The order isn't perfect. You're never going to find a perfect group of people, okay? So I'm going to tell a joke now. It's actually a Mogavagsa's joke. We were sitting around in our chapter. We had invited some people who just asked for ordination to come and tell us why they wanted ordination, and we were going to talk about why we valued being an order member. And Susiddhi said he valued being an order member because it was quality people. It was coming together with quality people. And Amogavamsa said, after he came afterwards, he said, yes, it is. It's a bit like a box of Quality Street. Inside there are lots of flavours, some of which you won't like, and on the box it says, beware, may contain nuts. And if you thought of that on the spur of the moment, that's really good. So the order is a bit like a box of Quality Streets. Inside there are lots of flavours, some of which you won't like, and it may contain nuts. But I decided, I suppose, that despite the flavours I really hated, and despite the occasional nuts, this was still the most positive thing that I had come across. It had done me loads of good. It had done me loads of good. I could see it had done loads of others loads of good. I could see that it was a real force for good in the world. I didn't agree with everything by any means, but I knew I would never find anything where I agreed with everything. And if I was going to get real and stop sort of trying to live in some ivory tower, I needed to be willing to make some compromises, work with what was there. And I'm really glad I did, actually, because that has given my life real meaning. When people come together, united around a purpose bigger than themselves, something magical starts to happen. I think something a bit magical has started to happen in Sheffield Buddhist Centre. I think that us rather motley crew of individuals who sort of put ourselves to one side to some extent and came together around a bigger purpose to create this place, we seem to have done something which is much bigger than the sum of the parts. We seem to have done something which is you could never have predicted. So for that to happen, you have to sort of get yourself out of the way and unite around the jewel. But that is also uniting around, getting yourself out of the way and uniting around the jewel, uniting in a common purpose that's bigger than you, is also the fastest way we make progress ourselves. I'm absolutely convinced of that. Absolutely convinced of that. It's the very real way we transcend our old selves and step into bigger shoes. That is the way we do it. So yeah, I think there is something magical that happens when people come together in that way. And I think there's something magical about the order, actually. When I think of what has been achieved, well, I talked about this place, but if you think about what has been achieved in the few decades since Sangha Night started teaching the mindfulness of breathing in a poky little cellar somewhere in North London, it is absolutely amazing. It's unbelievable. It could never have been predicted. And Sangha Night says about this that he doesn't feel as though he founded a new Buddhist movement. In fact, he says he thinks he was a really unsuitable person to found a new Buddhist movement. And he doesn't feel as though he founded a new Buddhist movement. He feels as though something founded a new Buddhist movement through him. As though something was trying to manifest, almost used him to do it. And that is sometimes the way, without being grandiose, that is sometimes the way it feels, as though something is trying to manifest. It sometimes felt a bit like that in Sheffield, that as though something is trying to come into existence, and it sort of uses the motley crew around for that to happen. And that idea of something, as it were, trying to manifest through our order, I think is another aspect of the mythic vision of the order. Mine and many other people's as well. It's as though there out there in the future is the real order trying to manifest, trying to come into existence. A completely new way of human beings being together, a completely new sort of community. What Sangha Night calls the third order of consciousness, the Thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara. It's out there, it's trying to happen, and we can be part of making it happen. I think sometimes it just glimmers through. It glimmers through maybe when sometimes in order events like pujas sometimes. You get a sense of it, you get a sense of that. And we join the order. Partly the reason we join the order is to take part in that, take part in bringing something wonderful into existence. Something that doesn't fully exist at the moment. A friend of mine once said to me, if it was just about the order as it is now, he wouldn't be interested. For him, it's about the order that could be in 300 years. And most of us maybe don't think over that time scale, but thinking about what we could bring into existence. What could it be like? It could transform the world. It could be not just an enlightened individual, but an enlightened community, a potent force. And the world needs something. I mean, the world is, where's it going? What's going to happen? It's not looking great, to be honest. The world needs a completely different way of human beings envisioning their existence. So if you know something better, I would suggest, and you want to do something about that, I would suggest you throw yourself into it. But if, like me, you don't know anything better and this is the best you've come across, and if you've been around for a while, and if you want to make a contribution at the same time, grow yourself, then maybe you should throw yourself into this and ask for ordination. If you've been around a while, but that might seem like still a really huge step, what is he talking about? You might take the first small step in that direction and being part of this project and think about becoming a mitra if you aren't one already. If you're still thinking, well, I wonder whether this is any good, and maybe I'm, sort of still trying this out for size, that's fair enough. That is absolutely fair enough. But even if that's you, and if you're sort of thinking, well, I'm trying to see whether these people are what they're about, even if that's you, we can all take on board a bit of Sangha action saying that commitment is primary. Commitment is primary. What you get out of the spiritual life will be directly proportional to what you put into it, at whatever level you're involved. So I'll just leave you with that. Commitment is primary. Thank you.